In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 4, where in our last chapter we developed GDP as a measure for total output. In this chapter, we will develop a measure for labor utilization by considering how to measure unemployment, to then distinguish between unemployment types and conclude by going over some unemployment data. Where in terms of today's lecture on measuring unemployment, we will accomplish this by considering the population of an economy to then distinguish between the portion of the population that is out of the labor force versus those who are in the labor force, which will then allow us to distinguish between what it means to be employed versus unemployed, from which we can then conclude by developing the unemployment rate. With all this in mind, beginning with some preliminaries, currently we are developing measures to gauge the performance of an economy with, where thus far we have developed GDP as a measure of total output. Now we are interested in a measure for labor utilization, in which we know goods and services are exchanged in an economy in the product markets, where these goods and services are produced by firms with their factors of production such as labor, where labor is supplied by consumers in exchange for an income process. What this means then is that labor is a determinant of total output. Therefore, we should know how much labor is being used to produce goods and services in an economy, in that if labor is being underutilized, then total output produced is less than what it could potentially be, whereas the closer labor is to being fully utilized, the closer total output produced or resemble that of what could potentially be produced, or in other words, relating this to production possibilities frontier. If labor is underutilized, then we're on a point below the production possibilities frontier, versus if labor is fully utilized along with the other resources, then we will be on a point on the production possibilities frontier corresponding to the most amount of output that can be produced given current resources and technology. With this in mind then, to develop a measure for labor utilization, this measure should do two things for us. The first is that it should convey active or idle labor resources to us, which means first we need to understand what is the difference between active and idle labor resources, which means knowing what a labor resource in an economy is, as well as classifying portions of the population with respect to being a labor resource or not. And the second thing this measure should do is it should allow for comparisons, where in our discussion of GDP, we know that this means requiring a common unit. So, beginning with in terms of classifying a population, in an economy, there's going to be a sum of individuals residing there. That sum of individuals will be the total population. And in terms of the population, there will be those who are labor resources and those who are not, where those who are not labor resources will be considered out of the labor resource or out of the labor force, whereas those who are labor resources will be those who are in the labor force. From which, in terms of these labor resources, we can classify if they are active or idle. Active being in that they are currently producing goods and services with, in terms of contributing to total output, or idle in that they currently are not producing goods and services with to contribute to total output, where active labor resources will be employed, whereas idle labor resources will be unemployed. Moving on to these classifications a bit more carefully, we mentioned that those who are not labor resources in the economy will be the portion of the population that is out of the labor resource. Well, these are going to be individuals who are either not old enough or they are currently not working for pay, nor are they looking for paid work, where two instances of this occurring will be individuals who are under the age of 16, which will be the threshold age of being in the labor force or classifying as a labor resource for an economy, or a second instance will be those individuals who have retired from the labor force of the economy. This contrasts with the labor force, which we mentioned was the pool of labor resources for an economy. So this is going to be the portion of the population that is willing and able to supply their time for labor, where we mentioned that we could further break down this portion of the population in terms of active labor resources in that they were employed, or idle labor resources in that they were unemployed. Returning to our active labor resources, this is going to be the portion of the labor force that is 16 and over who are working for pay or are looking for paid work. Where observe that this classification of employed means that disqualifies individuals who are under the age of 16, which gives further reference to what we mentioned in terms of out of the labor force, in which individuals could be too young, and observe that the individual needs to be working for pay or are looking for paid work. So if the individual is working but not receiving pay and that they are volunteering and that is their only form of work, that would disqualify them as well. And if they were not currently working and they were not looking for paid work, then this would disqualify them from being employed and in the labor force as well. Now, moving on to our idle labor resources, we mentioned that this would be the portion of the labor force that's classified as unemployed. And these are going to be individuals 16 and over who are not working for pay, but are looking for paid work, where some reasons why unemployment can occur in the economy can be that they're job losers and that due to performance, they lose their job, or if an economy begins underperforming, their role may not be supported anymore. An alternative reason could be due to reentrance, in that a stay-at-home spouse could have left the labor force, but later on in their life, they decide they would like to return and seek employment, and during that period where they're looking for paid work, they would be classified as unemployed. A third reason would be job leavers, in that an individual could seek to choose a different career path, and as they leave their initial job, there will be a period in which they are searching and unemployed. A fourth reason will be new entrants. Recall that the age was 16 in which an individual can qualify for being a labor resource in the economy. Well, when an individual turns 16 and begins looking for paid work, well, during that period where they're looking for paid work, they'd be classified as unemployed. Now, in terms of unemployment, at the macro level, the problem with this is that labor resources are going underutilized, which we mentioned in terms of the production possibilities frontier. This means being below the curve, and the economy is producing below potential total output. Whereas at the micro level, the problem with unemployment is if an individual becomes unemployed, then they miss out on some labor income, which means with less income comes fewer choices. And if that source of labor income was one of their only, if not only source of income, then day-to-day operations in terms of their life can become quite difficult. So then, now that we have classified the population of an economy and know that unemployment leads to the macro problem of producing below potential total output, let us now construct our measure in terms of unemployment, which we mentioned would be the unemployment rate. And we will do this by considering those who are unemployed with respect to the overall labor force, where now defining the unemployment rate in terms of this is just going to be the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed, where mathematically this is just going to be the ratio between those who are unemployed versus the overall pool of labor resources in an economy, that is, the labor force. So to see how the unemployment rate is a measure for labor utilization, let us consider an example, where on the right we have a table of an economy's population and some classifications, where in terms of the total population of this economy, this is just going to be the sum of 45, 12, 15, 3, and 5, where this economy thus has a population sum of 80, where in terms of out of the labor force, these are going to be individuals who are not labor resources for the economy. So this means they're either going to be under the age of 16 or they are not working for pay and are not looking for paid work, which this just means that this is just going to be classification 2 and 3, as well as 4. So giving us a sum of 12, 15, and 3, giving us that there are 30 individuals who are out of the labor force. Now moving on to the labor force of this economy, this is going to be the pool of labor resources, which means this is going to comprise individuals who are 16 and over who are either working for pay or are not working for pay but are looking for paid work. So this is going to be classification 1 and our final classification. So the sum of 45 and 5, or that there are 50 labor resources in this economy, or in terms of active labor resources in the form of employed, this is going to be individuals 16 and over who are working for pay, so 45 individuals from our labor force. And in terms of idle labor resources, these are going to be our individuals who are 16 and over who are not working for pay but are looking for paid work. So this is going to be our remaining 5 from our labor force, giving us 5 idle labor resources. So then now pulling together our classifications of our economy, we know that out of the labor force is 30 individuals. Our labor force is 50 individuals, where employed individuals was 45, and the unemployed individuals was 5, where we are recapping this information. Then constructing our unemployment rate, we know that this is going to be the ratio of our idle labor resources versus our labor resource pool, or that it's going to be the ratio of 5 and 50, giving us that the unemployment rate is 0.1, or that it is 10% in this economy. Now, to see how we can make comparisons with the unemployment rate, let us check back in with this economy 1 year later. Where on the table on the right, we have our classifications from our prior slide, in that our economy is 80 individuals, sum of 30, 45, and 5, where out of the labor force was 30, employed individuals was 45, unemployed 5, giving us a labor force of 50, or an unemployment rate of 5 divided by 50, giving us 10%. Checking back in with this economy 1 year later, at year 2, we see that out of the labor force is now 28, so a reduction of 2 individuals, whereas our employed individuals has gone from 45 to 48, so an increase in those who are unemployed, those who are employed. And in terms of those who are unemployed, that is our idle labor resources, from year 1 to year 2, there's been a reduction of 1. So in terms of our unemployment rate, our labor force, the sum of employed and unemployed, for year 2 is going to be 48 plus 4, giving us 52. And our idle labor resources is going to be 4. So our unemployment rate in year 2 is going to be 4 divided by 52, giving us 0.0769, or 7.69% in terms of those who are unemployed with respect to our pool of labor resources. So then in terms of the unemployment rate as a measure, we see that labor utilization is conveyed in that in year 1, we see that 10% of our pool of labor resources in this economy are idle, or that 90% are active, whereas in year 2, 7.69% of our labor resources are idle, or that 92.31% are active. And in terms of comparisons, we see going from year 1 to year 2 that there's a 2.31% percentage point reduction in terms of the unemployment rate. Therefore, we see that both of our criteria are satisfied as needed. With this in mind, what we'll pick up in our next video is we will consider the different forms of unemployment.